A nationwide move to disarm would change how Americans think about safety, policing, and freedom, and not just in obvious ways. Look at places like Japan and the UK. Strict limits on private guns are tied to far lower gun homicide rates and a public mood where people expect police to hold most of the responsibility for armed conflict. In Australia, a dramatic buyback after a mass shooting shifted social norms and made guns less central to everyday identity. But fewer guns doesn't automatically mean less crime. It can mean different crime patterns, new black markets, shifts in domestic violence dynamics, and a redefinition of self-defense. Watch to see clear comparisons, surprising trade-offs, and what historical evidence and other nations' experiences actually suggest would happen if America tried to disarm. Chapter 1. The Safety Paradox. Better core idea. Removing roughly 400 million firearms would dramatically reduce the lethality of everyday life. Situation. A domestic dispute or a case of road rage ends in shouting instead of a funeral. Because in the heat of the moment, there's no permanent solution within reach. Parallel. Police forces in the UK and Norway operate without constant lethal combat readiness, resulting in far fewer fatal encounters. An estimated 400 million privately owned firearms in the United States mean that lethal means are unusually accessible in everyday life. Removing a large share of those weapons would make impulsive acts far less likely to become fatal. When a heated argument or a traffic dispute occurs, the presence of a firearm transforms a momentary loss of self-control into a permanent outcome, because a single impulsive decision can end a life. Without that immediate, easily available, permanent solution, conflicts that once escalated to shootings are far more likely to conclude with shouting, bruises, or arrests. The change is not merely hypothetical. The mechanism is straightforward. Lower availability of guns reduces the probability the non-fatal altercation will become deadly. Countries where civilian access to firearms is tightly restricted show how this plays out in practice. In the United Kingdom, most uniformed officers do not carry firearms routinely. Instead, armed response units are deployed for incidents that genuinely require a firearm. That operational model shifts police training and expectations toward conflict resolution, negotiation, and restraint. In Norway, routine policing is similarly characterized by an emphasis on dialogue and non-lethal methods. Officers are trained to de-escalate and to reserve firearms for the most extreme situations. These policing philosophies coincide with far fewer fatal encounters between police and civilians than in contexts where officers are in constant lethal combat readiness. Cultural and mental shifts accompany the legal and operational constraints. In societies where guns are rarely available through normal retail channels, carrying a firearm is not considered a routine form of personal protection, and social norms discourage quick recourse to lethal force. People learn and expect that disputes are resolved through other means, calling law enforcement, community mediation, or simply walking away. That expectation changes behavior in the moment. For example, a driver who in another context might perceive a firearm as a means to assert control or intimidate is, in these environments, more likely to seek nonviolent solutions because lethal force is not culturally normalized or immediately available. Practical outcomes extend beyond fewer homicides. Emergency medical and law enforcement responses adjust as well. When police are not expected to confront widespread armed resistance, patrol strategies focus more on visibility, community engagement, and prevention rather than assuming every encounter could be a shootout. Training prioritizes communication, mental health intervention, and the use of non-lethal tools. The overall effect is a system where both civilians and officers operate under different risk calculations. The absence of pervasive firearms reduces the chance that a single heated moment will produce irreversible consequences. There are still challenges and trade-offs to consider, because knives and other weapons remain potential sources of harm. However, those methods are typically less immediately lethal and often allow time for intervention. The net result observed in countries with strict civilian gun access is a lowered baseline of lethality in everyday conflicts and a policing culture less dominated by the anticipation of instant lethal confrontation. In short, when firearms are not readily sold and widely present, the practical, psychological, and institutional landscapes change. Disputes that might have ended in funerals more often end in shouting, medical treatment, or legal processes instead. Chapter 2. The Power Vacuum. Worst core idea. Criminal groups don't follow gun laws. A ban creates a predator's paradise where law-abiding citizens are left exposed. Situation. A family in rural Wyoming, with the nearest police station 50 miles away. Without a firearm, the social contract collapses. The state simply can't provide immediate protection. U.S. factor. Unlike Europe, the U.S. has massive land borders and a multi-billion-dollar smuggling ecosystem. Criminal actors do not cease to possess weapons because laws say they must. When a prohibition removes commonly owned arms from law-abiding households, but leaves illicit supply chains intact, the balance of risk shifts sharply. In a remote Wyoming valley where a family's nearest police station is 50 miles away, that shift is not abstract. Response times that stretch into hours cannot substitute for immediate defense when an armed intruder approaches. The practical reality is simple. A state capable of legislating disarmament is not automatically capable of projecting instantaneous security into every isolated driveway and ranch gate. Communities in countries where private firearms are rare often experience different trade-offs. Many of those places are island nations or have tightly controlled external borders, and they pair restrictions with dense policing, extensive surveillance, and robust emergency services that can reach most urban and suburban areas quickly. Social willingness to accept the state's monopoly on force is higher in such contexts. People expect the police to be the first responders, and cultural norms favor deference to state institutions. Private security, alarm systems, and neighborhood coordination serve as common supplements. The mindset is one of collective reliance rather than individual armament. The United States presents a contrasting environment. Vast interior distances, long rural road networks, and extensive land borders create corridors that smugglers and criminal networks exploit. A multi-billion-dollar ecosystem exists around the movement of contraband, drugs, stolen goods, and weapons across and within national boundaries. That ecosystem does not vanish with a domestic ban. It simply channels firearms toward those who intend to break the law. When law-abiding citizens relinquish means of immediate defense while illegal markets continue to supply predators, the result can be a predator's paradise at the local level. Deterrence evaporates and violent actors face fewer immediate costs for escalation. Practical consequences for a rural family are concrete. Without a firearm, options narrow to fortifying property, relying on alarms and cameras, keeping livestock close or locked away, and coordinating with neighbors for watches. Those measures can help against opportunistic theft, but are less effective against armed, determined intruders. Short, decisive defensive actions become more difficult without a tool matched to the threat. Where the social contract is presumed to guarantee physical safety, its failure is felt first in places beyond rapid state reach. When that guarantee falters, communities either adapt through self-help, sometimes illegitimately, or endure greater vulnerability. In nations with different geography and institutional capacity, disarmament sits within supporting structures. In the United States, the same policy would intersect with unique territorial and smuggling realities in ways that make the risk of a power vacuum acute. Chapter 3. The Cultural Identity Crisis. Core idea. For many Americans, the Second Amendment isn't about hunting. It's a safeguard against government overreach. Situation. A montage of people surrendering their guns. Some feel relief and safety, while others experience a profound sense of loss, as if shifting from citizens to subjects. Countries with tight civilian gun restrictions generally record far fewer deaths from firearms and experience mass shootings far less often than the United States. Policies that make civilian sales rare or effectively absent, strict licensing, exhaustive background checks, mandatory training, secure storage rules, and limits on firearm types, are common denominators in places like Japan, the United Kingdom, Australia, Singapore, and China. Japan, for example, allows only narrow categories of guns for sport and hunting under a rigorous licensing regime that includes training, testing, police checks, and frequent inspections. Gun homicides there are exceptionally uncommon. Australia's large-scale buyback and tightened ownership rules corresponded with a notable drop in mass casualty shootings and a public expectation that serious violence is the responsibility of trained security services rather than civilians. In the UK, tight licensing and bans on types of weapons mean shootings are rare, though violent crime can take other forms. Singapore and China enforce near-total civilian prohibitions and combine that with strong policing, producing very low rates of gun violence. For many Americans who view firearms primarily as a check against government overreach, watching a montage of guns being surrendered triggers a cultural rupture, not just a change in household items. Some people feel an immediate physical relief. Fewer unsecured firearms in homes, reduced risk of accidental shootings, and a sense that public spaces are safer. Others experience a profound sense of loss, as if a civic role has been rescinded. A rifle or pistol can function symbolically as an extension of a civic identity built around the idea that citizens are the last resort against tyranny. Handing it over can feel like trading citizenship for subjecthood. The emotion is visceral and varied. Some people say they sleep better. Others say they no longer recognize themselves. Comparisons with societies where guns are scarce show how much of the reaction is cultural rather than purely practical. In countries where private firearm ownership is rare, the dominant narrative is that the state, through police and courts, protects rights and order, and citizens delegate the monopoly on force accordingly. That delegation is embedded in civic rituals, high public trust in institutions, acceptance of strict regulations, and social norms that stigmatize private armed self-help. Conversely, in places with militia or frontier traditions, arms carry meanings tied to independence, vigilance, and communal duty. The difference shows in everyday conversations. In Tokyo or London, people may speak about safety systems and public services, whereas in some American communities the focus is on personal responsibility and deterrence. Practical outcomes and subjective feelings do not always move in the same direction. Countries with stringent gun controls often enjoy lower rates of firearm homicide and fewer accidental shootings, and many citizens report feeling secure. But policy alone does not erase anxieties. When trust in institutions falters, so does the sense of safety that underpins voluntary disarmament. In societies where disarmament followed strong, consensual policymaking and visible enforcement, paired with investments in policing and social services, civilians tended to accept the trade-offs more readily. Where policy felt imposed, or where institutions were perceived as unreliable, surrender of arms was often accompanied by resentment, clandestine retention, or a heightened sense of vulnerability. The montage of surrendered firearms, therefore, captures a split reality: empirical gains in certain measures of public safety and a simultaneous unraveling of identity for many. Some people narrate the change as liberation from a culture of fear. Others narrate it as a loss of agency and a narrowing of civic status to passive obedience. Both perspectives are grounded in lived experience and comparative observation. How a society manages that transition, through transparent policy, trustworthy institutions, and inclusive dialogue, largely determines whether people will look at empty gun racks and feel relief, resignation, or that unnerving passage from citizen to subject. In short, disarming America would likely reduce gun deaths and accidents, force a cultural shift away from private armed self-defense towards stronger institutions, and create a period of enforcement and black market risk that can't be ignored. We'd gain fewer daily shootings and a different public rhythm, but we'd also need better policing, social services, border control, and community programs to fill the gap. Look at countries where firearms aren't freely sold: Japan, the UK, Australia, many Nordic states, and you see lower gun homicide and accident rates, a public mindset that treats guns as tightly regulated exceptions, and greater expectation that the state and community provide safety. Those gains came with political will, long transitions, and investments in enforcement and prevention. Illicit markets and rare violent incidents still exist, so no policy is a zero-risk fix. You might be thinking about your own street, your family, or how realistic any of this feels. Share what concerns or solutions matter to you in the comments. Your perspective helps shape the conversation. If you found this useful, like, subscribe, and ring notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. An on-the-ground look at how Japan, Australia, and the UK actually implemented restrictions, the trade-offs they faced, and which measures could translate to American communities. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.